I'm not going to ask them to censor anything. I'm not going to ask them to remove stuff from their platforms. But I'm going to say, if you are Google, you cannot claim to be green and then be giving a megaphone to climate denial content.
Welcome back, everybody. Richard Brubaker, founder of Collector Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through the series, I'm speaking with sustainable ambassadors around the world about their work in environmental, social, and economic challenges. Through this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by Imran Ahmed, who is the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Center of Countering Digital Hate. It's one of the world's foremost authorities on disinformation, extremism, and social media. And through this work, Imran's been advising legislators around the world on how to regulate digital spaces, including the U.S. Congress, European Commission, and the UK government. He has also just produced a climate denial research report where he and his team were looking at how these mediums, specifically YouTube, are being used by those who want to promote climate denialism. It's a fantastic research report that really gets into the nuts and bolts about how a small group of actors can use a social medium to actually create influence, to create confusion, to drive a narrative. For me, it was a fantastic report, which I'll link below, but it offered a lot of interesting insights and opportunities for, I think, us to learn how to better communicate, better engage, and to better use the algorithms for our advantage. And so with that, Imran, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. As a starting point, it'd be great for you to introduce yourself and a little about the work that you're doing there over at CCDH.
Thanks so much. Hi, my name's Imran Ahmed. I'm Chief Executive and I founded the Center for Countering Digital Hate, DC-based 501c3 that studies the spread of hate and disinformation, the way that bad actors weaponize digital spaces to create harm, the way that platforms and the way they're designed, their algorithms, the user experience lends itself to weaponization so easily, and the way that both sides profit from the spread of hate and disinformation, and then we try and do something about it.
When do you think, or where do you go back to in seeing like this weaponization happen? When did it change, and what are some of the roots, or what are some of the factors that are really prominent here? I mean, the algorithm is one of them, the business model. What are the other levers at play that you look at?
There are lots and lots of contingent circumstances that have happened along the way that have shaped the environment that we now find ourselves in. But at its root, the fundamental shift is mathematical. A decision was taken by social media platforms to reward engagement with amplification because they found that increased the amount of time people spent on platforms.
Yeah.
Which is to say that they said that the most engaging content will be amplified in the timelines, which are artificially constructed by algorithms, to billions of users. And engagement, they are unable and refuse to distinguish between positive and negative engagement. And what that did over time, and they realized this, is that it actually increased the visibility of disinformation and contentious content. And what it's done is every time the algorithm amplifies hate over tolerance, disinformation over good information, it's one drop into the bucket. But billions of interactions a day, trillions of bits of content served to people. And we're talking about the slow reshaping of everything. And it is impossible to understand the contemporary world, our information ecosystem, the means by which we do politics, the means by which we conduct discourse, the means by which we argue over things have changed fundamentally. And so CCDH kind of said, well, who made that decision? And how can we encourage them to change the way that they've configured their systems at the moment?
But if I can follow up on that for 1 second, I've noticed this. I mean, I create content. I put a lot of content out there that's very positive and very action oriented. I mean, is that content treated the same as something, say, negative and divisive, like at its fundamental basis? And the reality is, like, the users just like watching garbage, and they like the conspiracy theories more than they like something positive. Like, is there an element of that, or is it actually the algorithms do more favor the negative?
It's not to do with whether it's a conspiracy or not. It's to do with how contentious it is and how much it makes people emotionally react. Mark Zuckerberg a few years ago put out an email to users in which he showed a chart along the x-axis was how violative, which is how close to breaking the rules the content is, and on the y-axis was engagement levels. And what it showed is that as you get closer to the bar of actually breaking the rules, at that point suddenly there's an exponential curve in engagement level. And then he claims that once you break the rules, engagement drops to zero. That's not true, because actually they don't enforce their rules.
Right.
But what he was showing was that they'd worked out that basically near violative content gets the most engagement. And he knows as well that engagement drives amplification. So now that's a decision, that's a mathematical decision taken by executives there to promote the most engaging content, which is near violative in their own understanding of it, because that is the stuff that gets the most attention. Now, when you've only served people that content, when that's the most frequently amplified content, it starts to look as though that stuff is normal. And I don't want to be abnormal, so I better, maybe there's some truth in that. Where there's smoke, there's fire, blah, 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 etc., etc. So, and that's how you reshape the common understandings upon which our world are built. And then, leave aside the other problem that you then have algorithms that serve people more near violative content in the type that they already like. So what they're seeing is, let's say you like, I don't know, a particular political candidate. What you're going to see about them is the most close to violative content that you can. So it has a ratcheting effect on extremism, on polarization, and it is ripping apart the substance of our information ecosystem.
Sure.
And if that sounds like something a climate scientist would say about climate change, you're damn right, because they're really, really aligned issues. So again, we are looking at the slow poisoning of our information ecosystem or our natural ecosystem as a negative consequence of positive economic development by companies and an industry that is refusing to reform.
What's the individual user's responsibility here? They're ultimately the ones choosing to consume this, continue to go down that rabbit hole.
I mean, I tend not to blame normal people for problems caused by an industry and by a market and regulatory failure of immense levels. We've given advice to people as to what they can do. We've written, our first ever report was one called Don't Feed the Trolls, that explained these mathematics simplification to people in user-friendly language and gave them a playbook for how they can deal with it, which is to ignore people who are spreading hate and disinformation, to block them and not reward them with engagement, because engagement equals amplification and validation of their strategy. But, in the end, it's like saying, what can an individual do to combat climate change? You're damn right. Each of us can do something to combat climate change. But in the end, this is going to need systemic solutions, right?
And I mean, the only reason why I ask is a lot of people I see are talking about this in the general public, like, my feed is toxic. I hate what I'm seeing. Also, they show all this research about how it makes people feel. And I'm wondering, like, why aren't we seeing more people just disconnect?
Because it is addictive. I mean, and that's the other thing the platforms know, is that their platforms are not information engines. They're not connection engines. They're addiction engines. For all the technical sophistication of these companies, they are fundamentally just old-fashioned billboards.
Right.
And billboards that have found a way to keep us staring at them for hours and hours. I think that's one of the things we've just got to be really cognizant of, is that fundamentally their business is to keep us addicted for as long as possible.
Now, in terms of the way that they're used now, you've put out a really interesting piece of research on climate change denial and how the patterns have shifted, but also the way that the mediums themselves are used differently now. I'll link this research down below. Can you introduce the research itself and some of the big findings that you had through this process?
As I say, climate change is one of the 5 verticals that we study in climate denial content. One of the things that we've seen, observationally, and nearly everyone that is interested in climate change has seen, is that an increase in the amount of stuff that's attacking solutions and attacking scientists and science itself. And we wanted to know, well, is there a way of quantifying what has changed? Is this a real change, or are we just perceiving more of what's new to us? So we worked with researchers in AI to study thousands of hours of YouTube videos. So I think in total it was 4,000 hours, 12,000 YouTube videos produced by 100 channels over 5 years.
Wow.
And what the tool does is it looks at the content of the videos and works out what claims are being made. And what we found was really, really startling. It was that Old denial, which is the rejection of anthropogenic climate change, man-made climate change, had reduced drastically over 5 years. So it used to be about 65% of all the claims made by climate deniers were old-fashioned climate denial, the
Wow.
rejection of anthropogenic climate change. And about 35% was what we call the new denial. So it was attacking science, attacking
Mm.
solutions, and saying that climate change is actually beneficial for the world. That has changed radically over 5 years. So old denial has gone from 65% to 30%.
Mm.
And new denial has gone from 35% to 70%. And that is a radical change.
Yeah.
Essentially, what we've seen is the channels that we were studying realizing that they've lost the battle on anthropogenic climate change being real.
Hmm.
Um, and so, therefore, they have to shift to new narratives. Let me tell you why this.
Were they the same channels as before, or this is a
Yeah,
whole new group of challenge, a whole
yeah.
new group of challenge?
This is just studying 100 channels over a 5 year
Mm.
period. Part of the 100 of the biggest channels on YouTube. But what I think was really interesting is that there was two really important points here that the climate movement needs to hear. One is this is a story of success, guys. Like
Mm.
we this is a story of success for science in persuading people using evidence, using their own eyes, and the climate movement. That's scientists, advocates, journalists, politicians, everyone that's been fighting to build awareness of anthropogenic climate change. You succeed through really effective communications. But it's also a story of cynicism. It's the
Yeah.
cynicism of the other side. And I think it's really, really laid bare who they are. They were never trying to debate the science. And I can tell you they
Right.
weren't, because they
Right.
have segued so neatly from realizing that people don't believe their nonsense anymore about anthropogenic climate change into going,
Mhm.
hey guys, I know climate change is real, but you know what? The solutions are even worse than the problem. And so
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
are incredibly sick because their aim is not to debate the science. Their aim is to stop action being taken on climate change.
I've dealt with these trolls for many years. I have a couple who have. I did not follow your playbook by ignoring them. I engaged them for many years, and I question whether or not their goal is to stop action on climate change versus just create profitable viral content because it's an easy thing to do. It's a very narrow population of people who sit there and watch that, but they seem to be very engaged. They seem to be completely all in on their community and driving that silo deeper. And there seems to be a business model that supports that.
I think everything that you say is correct and true. And let me put some flesh on the bones here.
Mm.
So, you're talking about 100 channels here. In the pandemic, we found that 12 individuals and their companies were responsible for 2/3 of the disinformation that was being shared online. We found similar results when we've looked at climate denial content. So, we released a report called the Toxic 10 a couple of years ago, which showed that
Yeah.
10 major channels, major content producers were responsible for half of all the shares of climate denial content online. You're damn right they were doing it for money, and in fact, because these channels are, for the main part, they are monetized with advertising, and their
Hmm.
videos are monetized with advertising. They get a revenue share of that. So you're right. There
Right.
is now this really, gosh, desiccated, awful, cynical business model of produce controversial content, that disinformation, and just let it get to a small audience of people who dislike it and like it.
Yeah.
And those people who are hyper engaged on the fact checking side, who
Hmm.
actually, by interacting with that content, then amplify it to millions more. So you're
Yeah.
right, they don't have big audiences themselves, but the platforms reward them with amplification.
So you have these findings, you generate this report. When you were releasing it, who did you view as being the primary stakeholder that you wanted to target? And what were you hoping to accomplish?
Well, let's start with our different stakeholder groups. So first of all, we've got the companies themselves. So YouTube in this instance. So YouTube's rules already state that they will not monetize or amplify climate denial content.
Mm.
We said to them, well, hold on a second. If that is true, you are still putting some ads on old denial content, so your system's not working great. And you should extend your rules to include the new denial as well, because that clearly contravenes scientific consensus and is inaccurate or lies for the main part. So we
Mm.
said to them, you should do better. So that's one audience, right? The second audience is to the climate movement itself. and to say, hey guys, much respect, like you've done an enormously fantastic job on the old denial, but guess what? They found we know that you suspected that something was changing. We've got the numbers to prove it. And what we think we've got is actionable intelligence that people can use to reconfigure the effort, the spend, the way they develop counter narratives over the coming years. So, this is a business case for the big sort of climate funders, the big climate organizations to kind of go, well, we should be investing a substantial amount into the new denial and combating that with counter narratives and with counter disinformation work. And the final set of stakeholders were regulators to say, look, here's the thing about these companies. Just remember, this has got nothing to do with freedom of speech. This has got to do with the fact that they are willing to pay. And if people are paying for stuff, that's fine, but tell us about it. There should be transparency on the economics of these platforms as to how they reward content. I'm not going to ask them to censor anything. I'm not going to ask them to remove stuff from their platforms, but I am going to say, you shouldn't, if you are Google, which claims to be a green company, you cannot claim to be green and then be funding, amplifying, giving a megaphone to climate denial content.
All right, so this kind of offers up the opportunity to talk about regulators. We just saw another round of where the U.S. Congress has gone through this process of bringing up, some of the leaders of these companies to publicly shellac them. And I'm curious, when you watch that, what did you see? Like, what do you see is happening with the regulators? Are they even equipped for this? Do they understand what's going on? Are they asking the right questions? Like,
I'm a really deeply uncynical and very optimistic person. And so actually, I took all the positives I wanted to out of what I saw last week in the Senate, which is that what I saw was actually some very smart questions by some really engaged legislators about the impact of social media platforms on kids' mental health, right? And whether or not they're doing enough on child sexual exploitation and grooming. One of our studies showed, for example, that if you set up an account as a 13-year-old girl on TikTok, within 2.6 minutes, TikTok's For You algorithm is giving you self-harm content, and within 8 minutes, eating disorder content, every 39 seconds on average. And that was statistics that were in the briefings that had been sent to those senators. They knew about it, and I think that they held those companies to account very well. But the problem isn't their awareness of the problem, and I'm glad that they understand it now. The problem, as always in the US, is about their ability to translate that into meaningful legislation. So we are advocating really hard for something we call the STAR framework, which is, safety by design, transparency, accountability, and responsibility. Now, nearly every single jurisdiction in the world has progressed against that. The EU's got legislation, the Digital Services Act. The UK's got the Online Safety Act. Canada passed something called C18, which was a media regulation bill, but they're actually looking to build a new framework bill under a new ministry, the Ministry of Justice, rather than Heritage. Australia and New Zealand have made progress as well, and Australia's already got an e-safety commissioner in place, Julian Grant. But I do think that we need to see the US moving as well, because the US is, in particular, this is really apparent when it comes to extremism and to kids. The US legislature has failed to have the backs of American parents. And as a new American parent, I want my legislators to protect me and my kids. And I want, I don't want to be told it's my job to fix everything every time. It's no good saying, every one in 3 Big Mac is poisoned. Yeah, but it's up to you to work out which one it is. Can you please stop them from putting poison in the Big Macs?
Okay, so I want to dig more into that, but I guess as a starting point, a framing question, free speech versus tragedy of the commons. What's the balance between public good and free speech as you see it when it comes to these? Like, how do you regulate? What is safe?
I think it comes down to the same ways that American law already deals with freedom of speech, which is that exigent harm is something where you ratchet up your interventions based on the exigency and the severity of the harm. And so and let me tell you how this comes on climate denial. I do not think the government should stick its nose at all into regulating climate denial content. Full stop. End of story. No way. it has no role to play there whatsoever beyond creating fair market circumstances so we can understand the way that platforms are changing the way that that information flows. So
Mm,
transparency. It's fine for them to ask tough questions. It's
yeah.
fine for them to ask for transparency, and then consumers can make decisions. And crucially, advertisers can make decisions too.
Yeah.
Can you imagine some of the world's biggest corporations, what they would find out if they were basically putting their ads were being placed by Google and YouTube on content that was lies about our planet that might lead to climate disaster? They'd be furious. Now, that's
Mm,
completely different when it comes to, say, the other type of stuff that we look at, which is hate content,
mm,
or if it's content on that might harm kids, so eating disorder and self-harm content. And the UK, for example, has gone so far as to make it a criminal offence to transmit content encouraging children to self-harm.
mm.
I think that's fair enough. Whereas when it comes to climate denial content, I think that is too close to the margins and it's just free speech, right? People have the
Yeah.
right to be dumb as well as smart,
Right.
and I think that's where I see the solution set.
Well, I would say that I would argue that Twitter or X is probably the first group to really see a debasing of their advertisers. Is the content all that different between what Twitter X is doing and say some of the other ones? Or is there something unique about Twitter X that just makes it easier to say, we're not going to advertise with you?
I think X is a particularly extreme example because of the way that Elon Musk has run it since he took it over. I mean, he
Mm,
did three things when he took over. The first thing is that he put up the bat signal to hate actors, to bigots, to disinformation actors, saying that no more censorship for you guys. You're my mates.
mm,
The second thing he did was that he opened up Arkham Asylum and let out all the people who'd been banned before, and tens of thousands of known disinformation and hate actors were allowed to use the platform again. And the
mm,
third thing is that he himself unveiled himself to be the Joker by going and promoting himself
mm.
disinformation like the Great Replacement Theory. And I think that for those three reasons, he's kind of made himself a target for advertiser displeasure.
If you had a magic wand, or if you had the ability to pull three levers and make progress on this, what would they be? Like what do you think needs to happen? What three things would have the most impact to bring the standards up, to provide stronger rail guards, to create that transparency accountability loop that you say?
So, first of all, transparency. You need to have good data, which is independently verifiable, to understand the way that algorithms work, the way that the advertising reshapes the lens through which they present the world. The second thing is accountability. So, there needs to be a decent body that understands these issues, that can ask tough questions. Now, whether that is a select committee or a new FCC, it needs to be something that's able to hold them accountable. And we're doing that job in the meantime. And the final thing is that we need to reform the laws in the US so that they can be held responsible. So one of the weird things in the US, and one of the things that senators were talking about last week from both sides and saying we need to change, is that
Mm,
in the US, because of a law passed in 1996, companies can't be held liable for negligence or product design defects
right.
if they're social media companies. And that is a unique get out of jail free card given to those
Yeah.
companies where they don't have American negligence law applied to them. And
Yeah.
we need to change that. And I think if you did those three things, transparency, accountability using that great data, and then where they've really, really screwed up and been negligent, and we found that through our accountability mechanisms, being able to hold them economically responsible. So creating disincentives for the
Yeah.
production and dissemination of hate and disinformation. I think that creates a culture of safety by design.
How can you hack the feed if you are someone in environmental, in social, in a nonprofit, whatever your cause is? How can you use the information that you've been publishing to the advantage of the cause?
This is really a story about villainy, a
Mm,
villainy by climate deniers and villainy by YouTube that people should
yeah.
be really angry about. This should really
Yeah.
get your juices flowing.
Mm,
And then telling them what they can do about it. And the truth is that there's very little that individuals can do about it, but we can back organizations like the Center, and we can also just raise these issues to other people, make sure that everyone knows that actually the bad guys have changed their playbook, and for us
yeah.
to tell our allies that the playbook has changed. But can I tell you that this
Mm,
report has had a bigger response than maybe any report we've ever had in its first month. It has had enormous interest from funders, enormous interest from civil society bodies. I'm giving speeches on this all the time. It is, I think, a reference point and a data point that will be used for years to come to understand how the approach of the other side changed. But I think there is to remember that this really exposes them as not being. It's not that they're just people who are having a debate about science. This is the other side. This is an implacable group of people who want to stop us taking action on climate change.
Do you think that any of the major platforms are coming around in terms of they see the regulation could change, so they might be liable? They see civil society saying, look, enough's enough. They see the regulators saying enough's enough. Like, they see the advertisers saying enough. Like, do you think that the market might self-correct?
Well, I think looking for the market to self-correct is putting optimism before pragmatism. And the reality is that this is a severe market regulatory failure that has led to a series of negative externalities and problems, which we're going to have to fix with a market and regulatory solution. So 7 years ago, when everything happened in England, I decided that I was going to spend the rest of my life probably working on fixing this market and regulatory failure. I think it will take years for us to put into place even the first tranche of legislation, then to see how that works, to look at emerging technologies, to put into place new legislation, regulation, and accountability, to build the understanding in civil society. But we're going to have to spend the rest of our lives doing this. But that's fine. I mean, that is exactly what we're going to have to do.